The night on the bridge, Marcus Carter's body ached from exhaustion as he trudged through the biting wind that whipped across the Brooklyn Bridge. The shift at the cold storage warehouse had stretched far past midnight, and every muscle in his back screamed with protest from lifting crate after crate. His boots slapped against the slick pavement with heavy finality, each step echoing his weariness. In his arms, wrapped in his only thick coat, his 2-year-old son, Eli, lay sleeping against his chest, his tiny breaths warm against Marcus's damp shirt. The child's soft weight was both a burden and a reminder of why Marcus kept moving when every bone in his body urged him to stop. He had no luxury of rest. Bills stacked like bricks against his spirit, rent loomed at the end of the week, and the heater in their tiny room groaned louder each night as if warning it was on its final breath. The rain had not simply fallen that night, it had slashed sideways with a fury, turning the bridge into a sheet of shimmering glass. The lamps along the walkway flickered against the gale, their halos of light struggling to cut through the mist. Marcus pulled his coat tighter around Eli's small body, though it meant exposing his own shoulders to the freezing air. He tilted, his face downward, counting steps, whispering numbers under his breath as if each counted pace brought him closer to a sliver of relief. His mind wandered to the cheap heater rattling back in their rented room, to the overdue daycare bill he wasn't sure how to cover, and to the gnawing ache of missing his wife Sarah, gone 3 years now in a fire that had left him standing in smoke and ruin with only Eli clutched in his arms. It was in that state, half lost in memory, half buried in fatigue, that Marcus first saw her. At first, he thought the shadow at the railing was only a trick of the storm, some trick of swaying branches against the mist. But as his boots carried him closer, the figure sharpened. A young woman, barefoot, her soaked dress clinging to her frail frame. She stood just beyond the barrier, fingers curled tight around the cold metal rail, her body swaying in rhythm with the wind. The sight yanked Marcus upright, adrenaline burning through the fog of exhaustion. His heart lurched into his throat. Wait, his voice cracked against the howl of the storm. He stopped, rain stinging his face, afraid that one sudden move would startle her into the void. The woman turned her head slightly, strands of wet hair plastered against her pale cheek. Her eyes met his for the briefest moment, hollow and storm-dark, and then her foot slipped. Marcus's body moved before thought could catch him. With Eli pressed tight against his chest, he lunged forward, slamming his knee painfully against the steel railing as his hand shot out. His fingers closed around her icy wrist at the last possible instant. For one terrible second, he felt the full weight of her body pulling down, his grip burning raw as her legs dangled over the black roar of the East River below. Eli awoke with a terrified wail, his small voice swallowed by the wind. But Marcus held on with a snarl of desperate strength. Don't jump. Marcus's voice was hoarse, but the command tore through the storm with the urgency of life itself. His teeth clenched as the slick rain made his hand slide against her skin, but he locked his grip, refusing to let go. Please, don't do this. Her lips trembled as she gasped against the wind. Let me go. I can't take it anymore. Her voice was thin, almost swallowed by the rain, but Marcus caught every word. No, Marcus barked, his chest heaving. He shifted Eli awkwardly, to press the boy against his shoulder, freeing his other arm to brace against the railing. My son is right here. You hear me? He's right here watching. I know that hollow feeling in your chest. I know the weight that crushes you until you can't breathe, but ending it here is not the way. Her body shook, more from despair than from the cold. her eyes unfocused, as if she no longer recognized the solid ground inches behind her. "I have no one," she sobbed. "I lost everything." Marcus's throat tightened. The memory of smoke, of fire devouring his wife's final scream, of standing in the ashes with Eli in his arms, all of it surged up, raw and merciless. He pressed his forehead against the wet steel and shouted through the storm, "I lost too. I watched my wife die. I felt the world fall apart in one breath. I wanted to give up, but I couldn't, because of him." He angled his shoulders so she could see the small boy clinging to his neck, Eli's frightened eyes peeking from beneath the wet coat. He pulled me back. "You'll find a reason, too, but not if you let go now." The woman's body trembled, harder, her wrist twitching in his grip with the faintest instinct to live. Marcus's heart pounded as the railing bit into his ribs. He made his decision in one breath. Carefully, he set Eli down on the slick walkway, wrapping the coat tight around him and whispering, "Stay right there, buddy. Daddy's not letting go." Eli whimpered but obeyed, curling into the coat like a small bird. Then Marcus threw his entire weight backward, muscles straining like steel cables as he hauled against the storm and her despair. Inch by inch, he pulled her arm upward. Twice, his foot slipped, sending terror knifing through him, but he snarled through clenched teeth, "Don't you dare let go." Her bare toes scraped against the metal as she kicked, finally catching a sliver of rail edge. "Push," Marcus shouted. She pushed weakly, and with one last heave that tore fire through his shoulder. Marcus dragged her over the railing and collapsed onto the platform with her sprawled against him. For a moment, the world was only rain and heartbeats, their gasps filling the night like thunder. She curled in his arms, her frail body shaking with sobs. Eli crawled from the coat and pressed his tiny hand against Marcus's shoulder, his innocent touch grounding them both. Marcus wrapped his arms around the stranger, whispering into her wet hair, "You're safe now. You're not alone." Through broken sobs, she whispered, "You saved me." "No," Marcus corrected gently, his voice rough but steady. "I only reminded you, you're worth saving." They sat in the storm, the three of them man-child, and stranger bound together by a choice that could not be undone. Asterisk, shelter, and stories. The storm had not relented by the time. Marcus managed to get the trembling young woman to her feet. She leaned against him, shivering so violently that he feared she might collapse again. But he steadied her with the same hands that minutes earlier had refused to let her slip into the abyss. Eli, still bundled in the coat, clung to his father's leg with the trust only a child could give, his dark eyes wide as he studied the stranger now pressed against Marcus's side. Rain continued to lash against the bridge, blurring the edges of the city lights in the distance. But Marcus focused only on moving forward, on getting them all away from the biting wind before it devoured what strength was left in their bodies. They stumbled along the walkway, their breaths ragged and their clothes plastered to their skin. Marcus did not know where he would take her. His rented room was no place for a woman in such a fragile state. The heater barely worked. The ceiling dripped during storms, and the mattress sagged like an old wound. For a fleeting moment, he thought of calling emergency services, of leaving her in the hands of strangers trained to deal with crises. But something in her eyes, when she had whispered, "I have no one," clung to him. He remembered too clearly what it felt like to stand in a crowd of people and feel invisible. He could not leave her in fluorescent hallways surrounded by clipboards and polite detachment. She needed warmth, not protocols, so instead, Marcus guided her off the bridge toward a ground-floor apartment, tucked into a side street not far from the East River. The man who lived there, Joe Miller, had been a paramedic before retirement, and though he carried the roughness of someone who had seen too much loss, his heart had always been steady. Joe had been there the night Sarah's funeral ended, when Marcus could barely stand under the weight of grief, and he had been the one to place a hand on his shoulder and murmur, "You're not carrying this alone." Joe was the kind of man who never asked too many questions, but who always seemed to have a spare blanket, a warm meal, or the right silence at the right time. When Joe opened the door that night, he took in the scene with one long glance. Marcus, soaked through, his knee swollen from slamming into the bridge, Eli clutching his father's coat, and the pale young woman wrapped in a borrowed scarf, her hair dripping trails across her cheeks. Joe did not demand explanations. He simply stepped back, letting the warm breath of his small apartment spill into the rain-soaked night. "Towels are in the basket. Heater's on. Sit before you fall," he said in his gravelly voice. Inside, the warmth was almost shocking. Marcus lowered Eli onto a rug near the heater, peeling back the coat so the boy could stretch his cramped little limbs. The child blinked sleepily and then, in the unfiltered way of children, padded over to the young woman sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch. He tugged at the scarf around his own neck, a little wool piece Marcus had found at a thrift store months earlier, and pressed it against her chest. "You cold?" he asked, his voice soft but sure. She blinked at him, stunned, and then let out the first sound of laughter Marcus had heard from her, a fragile, horse-shy laugh that broke into the quiet room like sunlight piercing clouds. Asterisk. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest at the sight. His son, deprived of so much, still knew how to give. It reminded him why he worked until his body ached, why he dragged himself home each night no matter how broken he felt. Children learned, not from words, but from what they saw, and Marcus wanted Eli to grow up believing kindness was not a luxury but a duty. Joe busied himself in the kitchen, and soon the faint hiss of boiling water filled the apartment. The young woman sat wrapped in towels, her hair darkened to a deeper hue by the rain, her eyes darting nervously from Marcus to the child, to the floorboards, as though she feared she might dissolve if she met anyone's gaze too long. When Marcus placed a steaming mug of tea into her hands, she held it with both palms, lifting it close to her face as if the rising steam could build a wall between her and the world. "You should take your coat back," she murmured, her voice rough from crying. "You need it more than I do," Marcus answered simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her eyes flicked up, sharp for a moment. "That's your only coat, isn't it?" Marcus did not reply, but the silence was enough of an answer. The corners of her mouth tightened with something between guilt and gratitude. She set the mug down carefully, her fingers trembling, then looked at him with a question that had clearly been burning since the bridge. "Why did you help me?" Marcus exhaled slowly, leaning back into the old armchair Joe kept near the heater. He looked at Eli, who had curled up against the cushions with his toy truck, the firelight reflecting off his lashes as sleep crept back over him. "Because once, when I thought I had nothing left, someone helped me," Marcus said finally, his voice low, rough-edged. "I was drowning in my own silence, and a friend came by. He didn't fix my life. He just sat with me, brought soup, held Eli so I could breathe. That's what kept me going until I could stand again. I never forgot that. So tonight, when I saw you, I couldn't walk away. Nobody deserves to fight that battle alone." The woman's throat worked as she swallowed, eyes glistening in the dim light. For a long time she said nothing, only ran her fingers along the chipped rim of the mug. Finally, her voice broke the silence, softer than the rain against the window. "My name is Ava," she whispered. "Ava Whitmore." "Marcus," he replied, inclining his head slightly. "And this little one is Eli." Her gaze fell to the child sleeping peacefully, and for the first time since he had seen her, Marcus noticed a faint shift in her expression. It was not peace exactly, but a fragile loosening of the iron clasp of despair. She studied Eli's tiny fingers curled around the toy truck, and Marcus saw a flicker of realization cross her features, that even in broken lives, there could be small, steady lights. The night unfolded slowly. Joe retreated to his room, leaving Marcus and Ava in the warm pool of lamplight, the air scented with chamomile. They did not trade endless stories. Instead, they shared silences punctuated by small fragments of truth. Ava spoke of losing her mother young and of growing up under the stern shadow of a father who measured love in usefulness rather than in presence. She admitted that she had once dreamed of being an artist, of painting the world in color, but had been told dreams that did not make money were nothing more than indulgences. Her voice faltered as she confessed that she had tried to build a life on someone else's terms, until the weight crushed her into believing she was nothing at all. Marcus listened quietly, his eyes steady but never prying. When she trailed off, staring into the steam of her cooling tea, he offered only one sentence, spoken with quiet conviction. "Love isn't about being useful," he said. "Love is about staying, especially when it's hard." Her lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. She pressed Eli's little scarf tighter around her neck and sat in silence, the heater's hum filling the space between them. For the first time in years, Ava allowed herself to feel tired without fearing what might happen if she let go. And, for the first time in months, Marcus felt the crushing weight of loneliness shift slightly, replaced by the fragile possibility that broken people could hold one another up long enough to see another day. When dawn broke, grey light filtered through the thin curtains. Marcus stirred from his chair, his back stiff, and looked toward the couch where Ava had been. The blanket lay neatly folded, the teacup empty, and beside it a slip of lined paper. Her handwriting was soft but steady. "Thank you for not letting go. I need to try standing on my own. I'll be okay." Marcus stood still, the note trembling slightly in his hand. Eli stirred awake, blinking his big eyes, and asked in a small voice, "Where's Miss Ava, Daddy?" Marcus tucked the note into his wallet, alongside the worn photograph of Sarah holding Eli as a baby. He pressed a kiss to his son's forehead, and whispered, "She needed to go for a while, buddy. But last night, she chose life, and that's already a miracle." He looked out at the bridge in the distance, washed clean by the morning sun, and thought quietly to himself, some bridges don't just connect shores, they connect people to people. Asterisk the hard winter. The weeks that followed Ava's departure stretched into winter, a season that seemed determined to test the endurance of every working man and woman in the city. Brooklyn did not show mercy when the cold came. The wind cut through alleys like broken glass. Prices of coal and heating oil climbed with merciless speed, and jobs that had once kept men afloat suddenly dried up beneath the frost. For Marcus, the days became a relentless cycle of hustling between temporary work sites, hauling, plastering, mopping, scraping frost from crates in cold storage facilities, whatever he could find to keep Eli fed and clothed. Each morning he would walk his son to daycare, press a kiss to his cheek, and whisper promises he was never entirely sure he could keep. "Daddy's got you. We'll make it through." At night, in their cramped, rented room, the heater wheezed and sputtered, as if it too was exhausted by the burden of survival. Marcus would watch Eli curl into blankets patched and resewn more times than he could count. And even as his body screamed for rest, he forced himself to stay awake long enough to tell stories of firefighters braving flames, of travelers crossing deserts, of fathers who never let go of their children's hands no matter what storms came their way. He told them not because Eli always understood the words, but because Marcus believed in the rhythm of reassurance. He believed that children should fall asleep with hope in their ears rather than silence. On the hardest nights, when his chest ached with the cold and his stomach knotted with hunger he refused to admit, Marcus would reach for his wallet. Inside, pressed flat and already soft at the corners, was Ava's note. "Thank you for not letting go. I need to try standing on my own. I'll be okay." He read it again and again, not because he believed every word, but because the handwriting itself was proof that on that storm-soaked night, she had chosen to keep breathing. That thought steadied him when fatigue threatened to drag him under. Sometimes the note felt like a charm, lightening his burdens. Other times, it cut like a blade, reminding him that she had walked away and he might never see her again. Still, he kept it, a quiet reminder that saving someone else had also saved a part of himself. By February, the strain had begun to carve lines into Marcus's face that no man of 33 should bear. One morning, pale sunlight filtered across a construction site where he had picked up work tightening bolts on scaffolding. The air was so cold that every exhale hung in front of him like smoke, and the steel beneath his gloves bit into his skin. An older worker warned him to watch bolt. Number 7 it had rusted clear through. Marcus nodded and tested it carefully, but even his caution was not enough. With a groan of metal, the bolt snapped. Time seemed to slow. The world tilted. The scaffolding shuddered and then buckled, and Marcus felt himself thrown backward. For an endless heartbeat, the city spun around him in a blur of white sky and grey steel. His back struck a crossbeam with brutal force, the impact tearing the air from his lungs and igniting fire in his ribs. Pain exploded through his body, sharp and merciless. He landed on the platform below, the breath knocked from him, the taste of iron thick in his mouth. The shouts of workers blurred into static, and then everything dissolved into white light and the rhythmic sting of antiseptic. When Marcus opened his eyes again, he was staring at the blank ceiling of a hospital room. A monitor beeped steadily beside him, its sound both comforting and mocking. He tried to shift, and pain roared through his chest like a storm. His left wrist was bound in plaster, his ribs wrapped tight, and a dull ache pulsed through his skull. A nurse entered quietly, her footsteps softened by years of experience. She told him the damage: cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, a mild concussion. He would heal, but slowly. Weeks of immobility loomed before him, weeks in which he could not work, could not lift his son, could not provide. Joe Miller had taken Eli in during those first days, the nurse explained, making sure the boy was cared for. When Joe came to visit, he carried Eli on his hip. The child wriggled free, racing to Marcus's bedside with arms outstretched. "Daddy." Eli cried, his small body pressing against his father's good side. The hug sent pain shooting through Marcus's ribs, but he welcomed it, burying his face in his son's hair. inhaling the familiar scent that reminded him he still had something to fight for. Joe placed a toy car on the blanket. He wanted. "You too have this," Joe murmured. "Said it would keep you from being scared." Marcus swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. Even broken, he had to stay strong for his boy. The days blurred together in a haze of painkillers, restless naps, and the steady stream of footsteps in hospital corridors. Marcus hated lying idle, hated the helplessness that gnawed at him with every passing hour. His thoughts turned dark in those quiet moments, whispering that perhaps he had finally reached the end of his endurance, that no man could keep standing forever when life dealt blow after blow. He stared often at the ceiling, wondering if this sterile white room would be where his story ended, not in flames or storms, but in exhaustion. It was on the third morning, when he was drifting in and out of shallow sleep, that the door opened and a strip of light cut across the floor. At first he assumed it was another nurse, but the footsteps were hesitant, careful, almost reverent. A soft voice broke the silence. Marcus Key turned his head slowly, as if moving the weight of the entire winter with him. Standing in the doorway was Ava. Her presence struck him like a breath of warm air against frozen lungs. She looked different than the night on the bridge, stronger somehow. She wore a cream-colored coat that contrasted with her dark hair tied back neatly. And in her arms she carried a bouquet of blue hydrangeas that seemed almost unreal against the sterile white of the hospital. "I thought," Marcus began, his voice rough, but pain cut his words short. "I know," Ava interrupted softly. Her smile trembled as she set the flowers into a plastic vase. "I saw your name in a small article about the accident. I came as soon as I could." She drew a chair close to his bed, folding her hands in her lap as though fighting to keep them still. "There's something I didn't tell you that night. My full name is Ava Whitmore. Henry Whitmore is my father." Marcus blinked, the name hitting him like another strike to the ribs. Whitmore was a name carved into the skyline of the city towers, corporations, magazine covers, endless wealth. He stared at her, disbelieving, until she nodded with a small, weary smile. "Yes, that Whitmore. The name heavy enough to smother me. The name I've been trying to outrun my entire life." The room fell into silence, punctuated only by the steady beep of the monitor. Finally, Marcus looked away, staring at the ceiling with a tight jaw. "Why are you here, Ava?" "Because," she said, her voice steady now, "the night you pulled me back. You had nothing, no wealth, no safety, nothing but a child, and the decision not to let go, and still you saw me. You didn't see a Whitmore or a failure. You saw a person. I never forgot that. And when I heard you were lying here, I couldn't stay away." Her words cracked something inside Marcus that had been held together only by stubbornness. He turned back to her slowly, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "You don't have to. I want to," she interrupted, more firmly, "this time, let me stay. At least for these days, when you can't lift your son without wincing. Let me give back what you gave me." For the first time since the scaffolding had collapsed, Marcus felt the suffocating weight in his chest ease. Just slightly. Perhaps the universe had not abandoned him after all. Perhaps saving someone else on that stormy night had opened a door neither of them could have imagined. Second chances. Eva kept her word. From the moment she pulled that chair close to Marcus's hospital bed, she did not vanish again into the shadows of her father's towers or into the silence of her own despair. Each morning, before the hospital halls filled with the shuffle of doctors and the rattling of meal carts, she arrived. Sometimes she carried a thermos of chicken soup, the recipe learned awkwardly over the phone from a cook who had once worked in her father's mansion kitchen. Sometimes she brought crayons and paper for Eli, encouraging the boy to draw at the foot of his father's bed so the hours would not stretch into unbearable monotony. Other times, she came with nothing but her presence, sitting quietly in the chair by the window. Her eyes turned toward the city as though she too was learning to be still after years of being told to run, perform, and obey. Marcus did not know what to make of her at first. He had never been one to lean on others. His pride, sharpened by years of hard labor and the relentless necessity of survival, resisted the thought of being helped. He had clawed his way forward with sweat and pain for so long that accepting comfort felt almost like weakness. But Ava did not push. She did not speak as though she was swooping in to rescue him, and she did not pity him. Instead, she folded his blankets when they slid crooked, replaced water cups without being asked, and distracted Eli with small games when Marcus's body was too sore to do more than breathe. Her presence was quiet, steady like the rhythm of a heartbeat you only notice when everything else grows silent. It was during one of Eli's visits that Marcus realized how much had shifted. The boy had drawn 3 stick figures on a sheet of paper, one tall with broad shoulders, labeled Daddy, one small with round eyes, labeled Eli, and in the middle, a taller figure with long hair, labeled simply Ava. Marcus stared at the drawing, his chest tightening as he felt something unfamiliar stir in him, a fragile blend of fear and hope. Eli had placed her in their story without hesitation, as though children knew instinctively what adults spent lifetimes doubting, that family was not just about blood, but about presence. That night, when Joe carried Eli home, the room shrank to just 2 people once more. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, and Marcus turned toward Ava with a heaviness he had carried for months. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I don't know if I can offer anything more than survival. I don't have promises left in me, just the will to keep standing." Ava looked at him for a long moment, then tugged the blanket higher over his chest with a touch so gentle that it silenced any further argument. "Then don't offer promises," she said. "Offer presence. That's more than enough." It was such a simple statement, yet it pierced deeper than any elaborate vow could have. Marcus closed his eyes, breathing in slowly, and for the first time since the accident, sleep came without the gnawing weight of guilt at his throat. Days turned into weeks. Marcus's ribs healed slowly, his wrist bound in plaster that kept him restless. But with each sunrise, he felt the fog of helplessness lift just a fraction. Ava, too, seemed to transform in those days. Away from the suffocating demands of her father's empire, she moved with a freedom Marcus suspected she had never known before. She laughed more often, sometimes with Eli, sometimes with Marcus himself when sarcasm slipped past his rough exterior. She confessed that she had picked up her brushes again, painting quietly at night in the spare room Joe offered her, and that the act of creating color on canvas made her feel like she was reclaiming a piece of herself she had buried years ago. Marcus listened to her stories and realized something quietly profound. Ava was not only finding herself again, she was teaching him what it meant to live beyond mere survival. He had been so consumed by the grind of rent, food, and fatigue that he had forgotten the subtle joys of music, color, and imagination. Through her, he saw Eli's world brighten too. The boy's laughter grew louder, his curiosity sharper, as Ava knelt on the floor to paint alongside him, or told him stories that ended not with lessons about resilience, but with dreams of flying birds and golden rivers. Yet beneath the warmth that began to grow among them, an unspoken shadow lingered. Ava's last name, Whitmore, was not just a piece of trivia. It carried with it a weight that could not be ignored. The press had begun to stir when word of her disappearance months ago leaked into tabloids. Questions circled. Why the daughter of a wealthy magnate had vanished? Why she had been seen with a construction worker after his accident? Why she had chosen silence instead of the expected path of inheritance and influence? Marcus could see the anxiety flicker in her eyes whenever her phone buzzed with calls she refused to answer. He did not press her, but he knew the storm was building. One evening, as the hospital room glowed with the last warmth of sunset, Ava sat by the bed with her sketchbook open. Eli had fallen asleep against her lap. One tiny hand curled around the corner of her sleeve, as if afraid she might vanish again in the night. Marcus watched them, his chest aching with a blend of gratitude and dread. "They'll come for you, won't they?" he asked quietly. Ava's pencil paused mid-stroke. Her eyes did not leave the page, but her voice trembled when she answered, "Yes, my father will not tolerate silence. He built his empire on control. He thinks of me as a piece on his board, not a person. And if the press discovers where I am, they will paint their own story. They will not understand what this means, what you and Eli mean to me." Marcus's hand tightened against the blanket. "And what do we mean to you?" Marcus's hand tightened against the blanket. "And what do we mean to you?" For the first time since she had reappeared in his life, Ava lifted her gaze directly to his. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. "You mean safety. You mean truth. You mean proof that love is not conditional." The words struck Marcus with more force than any storm ever had. He looked at Eli's sleeping face, then back at Ava, and though fear still gnawed at the edges of his heart, he realized something. Second chances were not about erasing the past, but about choosing to walk forward together despite it. And so, as winter thawed and spring began to press pale green against the edges of the city, the three of them, man, child, and woman, bound not by blood but by choice, began to shape a fragile rhythm. They cooked together in Joe's cramped kitchen, painted in the spare room, and shared stories that blended pain with laughter. Every day was uncertain, but every day also carried the quiet strength of people who had been broken and yet still chose to build something new. But Marcus knew, even as he let himself breathe easier, that the peace could not last forever. Shadows of Ava's family and the relentless eyes of the public were drawing nearer, and the bridge that had once nearly claimed her life was now becoming the symbol of a choice that would either break them apart or bind them together. Asterisk the bridge between. Hearts, the thaw of spring did not come gently. It rolled across Brooklyn in uneven waves, some days carrying the sweetness of blooming trees and others crashing down with storms that reminded Marcus of the night that had bound his life to Ava's. He had grown used to her presence now, so much so that he sometimes caught himself glancing toward the door, expecting her to walk in even when she wasn't due to visit. She had become a rhythm in his and Eli's days, a quiet, steadying current that flowed beneath the noise of survival. Yet with every passing week, Marcus felt the pressure building. The Whitmore name loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, and he knew their fragile peace could not hold forever. It was a Sunday morning when the storm finally broke. Marcus had been released from the hospital and, though still stiff in his movements, had returned to small shifts of work. Eli tugged at his hand as they walked down the street, eager for the pancakes Joe promised them. Marcus spotted the car. Before Ava did, a sleek black sedan parked against the curb, the kind of vehicle that never belonged on their block. When the door opened and a man in a tailored coat stepped out, Marcus felt Ava's hand tighten around his arm. Her face drained. Of color, the man was older, his hair silver but his posture unbending. His presence radiated power that had been fed for decades by money and control. Henry Whitmore. The older man's eyes swept over Marcus with a mixture of disdain and curiosity before settling on his daughter. "Ava," he said, his voice cold. "Steele, you've made your point. It's time to come home." Ava's hand shook, but she did not step forward. Instead, she moved closer to Marcus and Eli, as if instinctively seeking shelter. "I'm not going back," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her body. Henry's gaze flicked briefly to Eli, then back to Marcus. "You've attached yourself to this. Man, do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Your future, your name, your security. Do you think this life is worthy of you?" Marcus wanted to speak, to push back against the contempt dripping from the man's words. But Ava's voice rose first, stronger than he had ever heard it. "It's not about what's worthy of me, it's about what's true. And for the first time in my life, I feel safe, not because of walls or money, but because I'm seen. I am not going back to being invisible in your house." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Eli's small voice tugging at Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy, what's happening?" Marcus bent down, pressing his large hand over his son's tiny one. He looked into Eli's eyes, then up at Ava, and in that moment he understood. This was not a fight about money or legacy. This was a fight about what love truly meant. Not contracts, not usefulness, not appearances, but staying even when it was hard. Henry tried again, his tone softening, his words sharpened with persuasion. "Ava, you're confused. You think this is love, but it's desperation. When the hardships come, when the bills choke you, this man will not be enough." It was Marcus who answered this time, his voice low but firm. "Hardship doesn't scare me, Mr. Whitmore. I've carried it every day since I lost my wife, and I will keep carrying it because my son deserves a father who doesn't quit. Love isn't about having enough money to make the pain disappear. Love is about holding on when the pain arrives. That's something your money will never teach." The older man's jaw tightened, but Marcus did not flinch under his stare. Finally, Henry turned back to Ava, his voice cutting like ice. "You choose this path, and you are no longer my daughter." Ava's shoulders shook, but she lifted her chin. "Then so be it," she whispered, "because I'd rather be nobody with them than be nobody in your house." The sedan door slammed, and the car pulled away, leaving behind a silence that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Ava swayed, tears brimming, and Marcus steadied her with one arm. Eli wrapped his small arms around her leg, as if declaring, in the only way he could, that she belonged with them now. That evening, when the sun had dipped low and the bridge glowed in amber light, Marcus took Ava and Eli to the very place where their story had begun. The wind was gentler now, the river below calm as glass. Marcus lifted Eli onto his shoulders, pointing out the horizon. "Do you see this bridge?" he asked softly. "Most people think bridges connect two sides of a city, but sometimes they do more. Sometimes they connect people to people, hearts. Two hearts. This bridge gave me back your mother once, Eli, and then it gave me Ava." Eli's small fingers clutched his father's hair as he whispered, "So the bridge saved us?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, but more than that, it reminded us to keep holding on, even when we think we can't anymore." Ava stood beside him, her eyes glistening in the fading light. She reached for his hand, not timidly this time, but with the certainty of someone who had stepped away from the edge and chosen life again. Her fingers laced with his, firm and warm. "I was saved here," she said softly, "not just from the river, but from myself. And now I want to spend my life learning how to stay." For a long while, they stood together, father, child, and the woman who had once been a shadow against the storm. The city hummed around them, cars moving across the span, people rushing with their own unseen burdens. But on that bridge, Marcus felt a stillness he had not known in years. He looked at Eli's bright eyes, at Ava's trembling but determined smile, and he realized that survival was no longer his only task. He had been given a second chance to build something beyond endurance, to build love, not as a contract or a desperate grasp, but as a promise to remain. And as the first stars flickered awake above the city, Marcus whispered the words that had carried him from fire to storm to this moment of fragile peace. "You're still worth saving, always."